Hello, this is video lecture number 68. Today we are talking about from expansion to imperialism. Our subsections today are the foundations of empire, the War of 1898, and the spoils of war. So many aspects of 19th century American foreign policy were isolationist. Between 1814 and 1898, the U.S. avoided war with European nations, and American secretaries of state heeded George Washington's warning against entangling alliances. However, an active foreign policy did exist. The Louisiana and Alaska purchases, relations with Mexico, and the status of Native American tribes were important issues as the nation expanded westward to the Pacific Ocean. By the 1890s, the preoccupation with the frontier and the incorporation of the American West gave way to a new foreign policy, which reflected the status of the United States as an emerging economic power. American factory, oil, and steel products were competing for a share of the world market. The republic that, under Thomas Jefferson, had all but abandoned its navy had begun, with the urging of such men as Alfred Thayer Mahan, an ambitious naval buildup by the end of the century. But economic strength brought its own set of problems. Americans soon discovered that the modern world did not respond well to the counsel of 18th century leaders, especially if the United States wanted to be a world power. Stepping onto the world stage meant answering a series of difficult questions. How was a democracy to act as a world power? What was the proper mix of self-interest and principle in foreign policy? Should the United States control overseas possessions? And what if native peoples resisted? Both the American public and its leaders struggled over the answers in relation to Latin America, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. So let's have a closer look then from expansion to imperialism with our first subsection, the foundations of empire. By 1918, at the end of World War I, European nations' grip on their colonial empires was weakening. The United States ceased acquiring overseas territories and pursued a different path. It developed a more informal empire based on business interests rather than administrative control. President Woodrow Wilson believed the United States should steer a middle course between revolutionary socialism and European-style imperialism, which was the exercise of military, political, and economic power overseas. Historians used to debate turn-of-the-century U.S. imperialism as something new. Now, they emphasize continuities between foreign policy in this era and the nation's relentless earlier expansion across the continent. Wars against native peoples had occurred almost continuously since the nation's founding. In the 1840s, the United States had taken 1/3 of Mexico. But policymakers beginning in the 1890s went on a determined quest for global markets. Industrialization and a modern navy provided tools for the United States to flex its muscle. And the economic crisis of the 1890s provided a spur. Confronting high unemployment and mass protests, policymakers feared that American workers would embrace socialism or communism. The alternative, they believed, was overseas markets that would create jobs and prosperity at home. Intellectual trends also favored imperialism. As early as 1885, in his popular book, Our Country, Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong urged Protestants to proselytize overseas. He predicted that American Anglo-Saxons, the representative, let us hope, of the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, having developed particularly aggressive traits, calculated to impress its institutions upon mankind, would spread itself over the earth. Such arguments were grounded in American exceptionalism, which was the idea that the United States had a unique destiny to foster democracy and civilization. Fear of ruthless competition also drove the United States, like European nations, to invest in the latest weapons. American policymakers saw that the European powers were busily carving up Africa and Asia among themselves, while embarking on an arms race to build steel-plated battleships. In his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1890, U.S. naval officer Alfred T. Mahan urged the United States to enter the fray, observing that naval power had been essential to the growth of past empires. In 1890, Congress appropriated funds for 3 new battleships. President Grover Cleveland then continued the naval program. So let's move to the next section, the War of 1898. In February of 1895, Cuban patriots mounted a major guerrilla war against Spain, which had lost most of its New World territories, but managed to hold on to the island. The Spanish commander responded by rounding up civilians into concentration camps, where as many as 200,000 Cubans died of starvation, exposure, or dysentery. In the United States, William Randolph Hearst turned their plight into a cause to celebrate. Hearst's campaign fed a surge of nationalism, especially among those who feared that American men were losing strength and courage amid the conditions of industrial society. President Cleveland had no interest in supporting the Cuban rebellion, but he worried over Spain's failure to end it. The war was disrupting trade and damaging American-owned sugar plantations on the island. An unstable Cuba was incompatible with America's strategic interests, especially a proposed canal whose Caribbean approaches would have to be safeguarded. Taking office then in 1897, McKinley was inclined to take a tougher stance. In September, the U.S. minister in Madrid informed Spain that it must ensure an early and certain peace, or the United States would step in. At first, this hard line seemed to work. Spain's conservative regime fell, and a liberal government, taking office in October of 1897, offered Cuba limited self-rule. But Spanish loyalists in Havana rioted against the proposal, while Cuban rebels held out for full independence. On February 9, 1898, Hearst's New York Journal published a private letter by Dupuy de Lome, Spanish minister to the United States, in which he belittled the McKinley administration. De Lome resigned, but exposure of the letter intensified Americans' indignation against Spain. The next week brought shocking news. The U.S. battlecruiser Maine had exploded and sunk in Havana Harbor, with 260 seamen lost. Hesitant business leaders now became impatient, believing war was preferable to an unending Cuban crisis. On March 27th, McKinley called an ultimatum to Madrid: immediate armistice for 6 months and, with the United States as mediator, peace negotiations with the rebels. Spain, though desperate to avoid war, balked at McKinley's added demand that mediation had to result in Cuban independence. On April 11th, McKinley asked Congress for authority to intervene in Cuba. Now, historians long referred to the ensuing conflict as the Spanish-American War, but that name ignores the central role of the Cuban revolutionaries, who had started the conflict and hoped to achieve national independence. Thus, many historians now refer to it as the War of 1898. On April 24th of 1898, Spain declared war on the United States. Across the country, regiments formed. Theodore Roosevelt accepted a commission as a lieutenant colonel of a cavalry regiment. The decisive engagement of the war took place in the Pacific. This was the handiwork of Theodore Roosevelt, who, while still in the Navy Department, had gotten intrepid Commodore George Dewey appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet. Now the plan was, in the event of war, Dewey had instructions to sail immediately for the Spanish-owned Philippines on the other side of the world. When war was declared, Roosevelt confronted his surprise superior and pressured him into validating Dewey's instructions. On May 1st of 1898, American ships cornered the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and destroyed it. Manila, the Philippine capital, fell on August 13th. Nominally an independent nation, Hawaii now had long been under American dominance, since its climate had attracted a horde of American sugarcane planters. An 1876 treaty between the U.S. and the island's monarch gave Hawaiian sugar tariff-free access to the American market, with Hawaii pledging to sign no such agreement with any other power. In 1887, Hawaii also granted a long-coveted lease for a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. When Hawaii's access to the U.S. market was canceled by a new tariff in 1890, sugar planters revolted against Hawaii's queen Liliuokalani and negotiated a treaty of annexation. Grover Cleveland rejected the treaty when he entered office, declaring that it would violate America's unbroken tradition against acquiring territory overseas. Congress, though, authorized the annexation of Hawaii in July of 1898. Now, in Cuba, Spanish forces were depleted by the long guerrilla war. Though poorly trained and equipped, American forces had the advantages of a demoralized foe and knowledgeable Cuban allies. On July 3rd, the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor tried a desperate run through the American blockade and was destroyed. Days later, Spanish forces surrendered. American combat casualties had been few. Most deaths were the result of malaria and yellow fever. So let's move on to the spoils of war, our last section. The United States and Spain quickly signed an armistice in which Spain agreed to liberate Cuba and cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. But what would the United States do with the Philippines, an immense archipelago that lay over 5,000 miles away from California? Initially, the United States aimed to keep only Manila because of its fine harbor. Manila was not defensible, however, without the whole of Luzon, the large island on which the city was located. After some deliberation, McKinley found a justification for just annexing the entire thing, all of the Philippines. He decided that we could not leave the Filipinos to themselves. They were unfit for self-rule. Leading citizens, including Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and other peace advocates, enlisted in the anti-imperialist cause. Steel King Andrew Carnegie offered $20 million to purchase Philippine independence. Labor leader Samuel Gompers warned union members about the threat of competition from cheap Filipino laborers. Anti-imperialists, however, were a diverse lot. Some argued that Filipinos and Hawaiians were perfectly capable of self-rule. Others warned about the dangers of annexing 8 million Filipinos of a, quote, inferior race. In the Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for a payment of $20 million. But annexation was not as simple as U.S. policymakers had expected. On February 4th, 1899, 2 days before the Senate ratified the treaty, fighting broke out between American and Filipino patrols on the edge of Manila. Confronted by annexation, rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo asserted his nation's independence and turned his guns on the occupying American forces. The ensuing conflict far exceeded in length and ferocity the war that was just concluded with Spain. Fighting tenacious guerrillas, the U.S. Army resorted to the same tactics Spain had employed in Cuba. They burned crops and villages, and they rounded up civilians. Atrocities became commonplace on both sides. In 3 years of warfare, 4,200 Americans and an estimated 200,000 Filipinos died. Many of the latter included dislocated civilians, particularly children, who had succumbed to malnutrition and disease. The treaty, while guaranteeing freedom of religion to inhabitants of ceded Spanish territories, withheld any promise of citizenship. It was up to Congress to decide their civil rights and their political status. In 1901, the Supreme Court upheld this provision in a set of decisions known as the Insular Cases. The Constitution, declared the court, did not automatically extend citizenship to people in acquired territories. Congress could decide. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were thus marked as colonies, not as future states. In accordance with a special commission set up by McKinley, the Jones Act of 1916 eventually committed the United States to Philippine independence, but set no date. The Philippines later achieved independence in 1946. This does conclude our video lecture then for today. Go ahead and answer your review questions and continue on with your work.